Hi, Dan Albaum here. Thanks for coming to check out Market Impact Insights. Over the past several weeks, I've been hearing from so many readers of my new book, The Giving Edge, how it's really touching them and motivating them to make a commitment to bring a giving mindset every day. And you can experience that too through the stories of 37 remarkable humans who share how they discovered that making that commitment to bringing a giving mindset every day has given them exponential returns in business and life. It's available wherever you find books. Go check it out and let me know what you think. Now on to this week's podcast.
Welcome to another edition of Market Impact Insights, your podcast source for business leadership perspectives to help your business grow. Hear from experts in marketing, sales, business strategy, and more with practical advice for business success. Make sure you won't miss the latest episodes by visiting marketimpactnow.com. Now, here's your host, Dan Albaum.
Welcome back to another great episode of Market Impact Insights. We are in a world that is fast changing, technology, innovation. It just is moving so fast. Competitive intensity. As leaders, how do we keep up? How do we actually optimize the growth, development, and then the sustained results of our teams? And we talk a lot about continuous learning, that is so important now that we embrace that in the culture of our organization. We cultivate that as leaders. And we're going to dive into this whole aspect of learning. What are the dynamics? What is some of the science behind how we learn, and how do we really optimize to get the greatest impact from learning? We're going to do that with David Preston. David, born and raised in Los Angeles, he attended the public schools there, went to UCLA. He wrote for the Los Angeles Times. He taught at UCLA for 11 years, and he is passionate about this whole area of learning in education. He actually taught in America's fifth largest high school. So he's been in the classroom with next generation, really seeing the dynamics of how learning works. He's also a published author of Academy of One, and it's all about this idea of open source learning, which we'll get into as well. David, welcome to Market Impact Insights.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
So what sparked your original interest in going down a path in the education space and exploring how humans learn?
Well, it's interesting. I love listening to your introduction because, I hear market, impact, insight, all very loaded words that have usually nothing to do with schooling. And unfortunately, too many of us associate learning with schooling. And when we get out of one, we stop really doing the other. My actual adventures in formal education came as an accident, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But I've been a management consultant longer than I've been anything else. And my passion for learning started when I was a little kid. I loved learning, but I've always had a love-hate relationship with school. So when I was teaching at UCLA and when I was building a consulting practice in the late 90s, we were mostly focused on the messy human elements of organizational development. So things like sometimes training, but more often things like strategic planning or succession or team building, and along with that, dispute resolution. And it really sort of dawned on me that all of my counterparts who were doing things like the financial analysis, the marketing analysis, the technology, at the end of the day, all of their frustrations and all of their opportunities were in the same places as mine, human understanding. And right around that time, and nostalgically I say this was back in the days when we didn't have a traumatic headline every hour, it seems like. But after 9/11, a lot of us were asking really unusual questions, like how did we get here? How did we get to the point where this could happen in our world? And I was working with the best and the brightest. I had my graduate students at UCLA, my private sector clients, and I was listening, I think, with a different set of ears because unanimously, all of them, to a person, told me a version of the same story about how they had to recover from their formal education just to feel like they were whole people because they didn't get a user's manual for their brains or their body. We have a billions of dollars self-help industry. And they really felt like they had to recover from that, much less to thrive in their chosen endeavors. So a friend of mine asked me, he was starting a nonprofit at the time, and asked me to come with him to a meeting of Los Angeles Unified School District superintendents. And while I was at that meeting, I got into some friendly banter with one of the administrators who said, you academics, you're adorable, but you have no idea what happens on the days we don't give tours. Why don't you come teach? And I was thinking, you got to be kidding. Why would I do that? But the idea wore on me, and I thought it was going to be a domestic Peace Corps sabbatical kind of a thing. And I started teaching high school English, as you mentioned, at one of the larger campuses in the country. And at the time, nobody was using Wi-Fi. The public internet was not yet readily available for students in secondary schools. And so I broke a lot of stuff and started an interdisciplinary multimedia practice that eventually became known as open source learning.
Yeah. And I've got to ask you this, David, because we've all seen the TV shows and the movies, that new teacher coming in, right, at high school. Were you tested? Did the kids kind of put you through the ringer a little bit?
I was from the neighborhood that fed that high school, and I knew the names of the gangs, and it wasn't so much that they were testing me, because it was really them and me against the world. I'm a bit of a chameleon. I can function just fine in the boardroom, but I can also function on the shop floor. And, you can take the boy out of the neighborhood, but you can't ever really take the neighborhood out of the boy. But what did happen was, especially in those first few months, they all wanted to know what was wrong with me. Why would you come back here by choice? And to a lot of people, school is incarceration. And there's a case and a conversation to be had around that. Compulsory education is not the same thing as learning. Being taught and complying and being obedient are not the same things as testing personal hypotheses and exploring the world and pushing boundaries, which is what we are designed to do well through adolescence.
Yeah. I mean, I even think about that in my own experience in the business world, right? I mean, you think about all of the amount of time that's been invested in leadership education or functional competence education and learning, inside of these companies. And so much of it seemed to me about mindset. What you got out of it is, if you go in with the attitude, oh, this is compulsory, my manager is requiring me to do this, what I get out of that is probably going to be a lot less than if I view this as this opportunity to really develop myself and to learn and think about amazing outcomes. So I think mindset probably plays a big role in terms of just how we frame the whole learning experience. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think one of the enemies to our understanding and to our ability to thrive is specialization. Even when you go into the doctor, first of all, in Western medicine, you have to wait until something's wrong with you. Yeah. And then when you do go, if it's not cleanly in that doctor's discipline, then you have to deal with referrals and extra tests and portals and communication between. School is the only place that I know of where for an hour at a time, you have to think in one particular discipline, Spanish, math, whatever. And then a bell rings and you completely switch gears and you're no longer permitted to think in that discipline because now you're being told you have to think in something else. The rest of our lives are completely interdisciplinary. And when I work with organizations, or even when I give presentations and speeches at conferences, everyone is thinking on multiple channels. Everyone is feeling on multiple channels. And to try to compartmentalize that and say, oh, no, that's a marketing conversation, when really it's a relational conversation, or it's a succession planning conversation, or it's I'm hungry and I can't think straight, or I just found out that my partner's leaving me this morning and I can't think straight. We ignore these things at our peril, and then we wonder why people aren't on the same page in operations.
Yeah. And when you reflect back on your own personal journey, what's been some of the biggest learning you've taken from that? And have there been surprises for you along the way?
Oh, where to begin? I think the biggest surprise, as long as we're talking about schooling and learning, I mentioned that originally when I decided to teach, I was only going to do it for a year or two, maybe tops. And I made arrangements with all of my consultants. I was available via cell phone. I was still on advising the governor's economic council at the time in California. And what I realize now, looking back on those days, those first few days, my body had agreed to be on campus. My brain was still very wrapped up in my ego and my professional achievements elsewhere, which is the only thing that made that somehow okay with me at the time. And the surprise was when, so you mentioned it was one of the biggest campuses. We had over 5,000 students, and it was all the traditional stuff that you see in the movies, the 12-foot rolls of concertina barbed wire on top of the chain link fence, LAPD substation on campus, et cetera. The quad looked like Gen Pop at a minimum security prison. And one of my students walked in with a book, which was already a surprise. The book itself was even a bigger surprise. It was The Art of Happiness by the Dalai Lama. And I literally dropped I was so surprised I didn't think to be politic about it. And I just kind of wagged my finger and said, "Come over here. Where did you come from?" And it turned out that he had forged his parents' signatures on the applications and called them as he boarded the plane in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, to come to California. Wow. And he learned enough English, passed the course, graduated, and then invited me home for dinner. And this was the second surprise. I surprised myself by saying yes. And I think it's the unofficial long distance world record for a home visit, but I wound up in Tibet, Mongolia, and Western China for about a month with this young man and his family. And what I learned, I'll never be able to unring those bells, but what I learned about the role of the teacher, not as a classroom teacher, but as a guide in people's lives, I was treated so unbelievably well by everyone. I mean, the parents of this young man, there was one room with a door on it in their entire home, and that was their bedroom. And they insisted that they give that to me while I was there. And that was the tip of the iceberg of my experience. Mm-hmm. And when I came back, I realized that I had been transformed. I did not know what I thought I knew about a lot of things. And I think ever since, it may have been a low bar, but I think I've become a better person and perhaps a worse transactional agent because I've been trying to give away learning for 25 years since then.
Yeah. Well, there's been so much research in this area of learning and how humans process, retain information. What do you think are still some of the biggest misperceptions about that when people are thinking about just learning as an experience?
I think one big misperception is that we need to like a task in order to fully engage with it or get good at it. I'm a big fan of some elements of positive psychology and Martin Seligman's research, but it turns out that our brains are pretty complicated places. And if you look at an fMRI, when we do or say even the most seemingly simple things, multiple parts of our brain light up and coordinate to make those things happen, with one really notable exception. Willpower and tenacity. Willpower, I'm not going to do that no matter what. Tenacity, I'm going to do that no matter what. And it turns out that there's one primary area in the brain right behind our forehead that's responsible for willpower and tenacity, and it's called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex. And we can actually exercise this and grow our capacity for willpower and tenacity. That when you think about things like resilience or grit or determination, anything that requires a commitment and sticking through making mistakes and getting better and improving, you can grow by growing your anterior mid-cingulate cortex. And the best way to do that is to acknowledge that you don't like what you're doing and do it anyway. The easiest example that I usually give is the cold plunge. No one that I've ever met who's being honest loves that first sensation. Yeah. If you've never done a cold plunge, whew, and when you stick with it, it's not a question of, maybe you get better. I don't know if it's a skill, but the idea is that you grow your capacity for willpower and tenacity in everything else that you do. So I'd say a misconception is that we have to have that spoonful of sugar to make the medicine go down. I say, hate the medicine, take it anyway, and get better.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. And so much when we think about learning, there's the aspect that that it can be a very solo experience, but then also in the context of groups. Whether you're in school or you're in a team, in an organization, you may be going through a learning experience together. Where do you see the role of community in creating more meaningful learning?
I think it's more like, where don't I see the role of community? We are social animals. As long as I'm talking about the brain, and I don't want to misrepresent myself as a neurologist, I am not. But when you think about the parts of our brain that are geared, like the amygdala, for fight and flight, or the parts of our brain that are responsible for our executive functioning and our connection, it doesn't take a lot just to look at the size of human development and realize that we are geared for connection. And even if we are doing a solo, there have been classic examples of mathematicians who labor in solitude for years sometimes. But in the end, it's the presentation of the discovery and the real, it's almost like the classic hero's journey, right? You go on that call to adventure, but it's the coming home. It's the sharing of the wisdom. So, and that's on the extreme end of the spectrum. For most of what we do it, if not in collaboration, at minimum in connection, or at least in plain sight of the people with whom we work and live and socialize. And I think that we are at a very precarious point in history. A lot has been written and spoken about this. We may even be at an inflection point, because so many people have retreated to positions behind their screens,
yes,
and they're not in direct contact with each other, that it is actively hurting our ability to learn and function.
Yeah. I mean, my very straightforward social experiment that I do is if I go into a restaurant and I'm just looking at what's going on, at tables today versus maybe even 20 years ago. And just the reduction in true human conversation, interaction, everyone still, or a lot of people are just locked into their screens, and they're scrolling. And it's just, even when we're sitting next to many people, we're still isolated because we're so conditioned into just craving and being dependent on those devices.
It's interesting. When I first started sharing open source learning, because teaching is a uniquely solitary endeavor, only because even though you're surrounded by people, you don't get to play with kids your own age. And when I started sharing with other practitioners and with people in the field, researchers, et cetera, what I was doing and the results that it was creating, a few things became apparent. First of all, no classroom teacher can be expected, especially at this point in history, especially when there's a non-zero chance of being shot in the workplace, of being fully aware, much less expert, in every content area, in addition to being a sergeant at arms and a clerk and all the other things that teachers are asked to be. However, we have all of these tools. We've been in the middle of this phenomenal communications revolution, where when I was leading learning communities in schools, and I still do this with organizations, if I were to ask you what you wanted to learn, odds are it wasn't going to be related to the curriculum that the State Board of Education had planned that day. But the good news was, if I had a student who wanted to learn to fly an airplane, we knew how to get connected to a pilot somewhere nearby. And this is a true story, by the way. 3 months after I learned that one of my students wanted to fly, I was 3,000 feet up in the air in the backseat of a Piper Tri-Pacer with this kid at the stick. Take that, driver's ed. It was definitely a terrifying moment.
You made it happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So the exciting opportunities are definitely there. But the other thing that happens, and you mentioned, restaurants, there used to be studies that would say things like, a couple at a table who's quiet is probably longer in the relationship than the couple who's gabbing at each other. Mm-hmm. And that can sometimes indicate a security and even a serenity in the relationship. Yeah. Now, though, when I shared open source learning, as I mentioned, the first people that got excited about it were not so much the new Silicon Valley, the Bro Bra set, but the original, the OG Silicon Valley, and who were really idealistic. If you remember Stuart Brand's Whole Earth Catalog, for example,
Yes.
The executive editor was a man named Howard Rheingold. And I was asked to give a talk at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. And the Institute for the Future, if your listeners don't know, is a think tank that was a spinoff from Rand Corporation. And it's widely regarded as, being very prescient in its analyses and predictions. And it was promoting open source learning as an opportunity to reconsider how we learn in community. And in the audience that day, Howard Rheingold happened to be there. Eventually, he wound up writing the foreword to my book, Academy of One. But he invented the phrase virtual community with a book of the same name, I think 30 years or so ago now. And as you were describing that restaurant view, I was remembering that in one of his books, Howard talks about looking out over Shibuya Crossing in Japan, in Tokyo, and seeing everyone not with their phones to their ears, but with their phones the way we all hold them now, down in front of us. And I started thinking about music and how once upon a time, it was the collective drum circle that drew people closer to the fire and closer together. And now we've come a long way around to like Ray Bradbury's Mildred from Fahrenheit 451, and we're all isolated with our earbuds.
Yeah.
I think it's recoverable, but I think it also requires more opportunities, whether it's through volunteering and service, or whether it's through recreation, or whether it's a concerted effort. But I think people need to get together in real space and real time and explore a laugh or a project with someone who doesn't look like them or sound like them. Because I fear for the alternative. There's too many ways to divide us.
Yeah, I mean, it's coming back together as human to human interaction. And of course, David, right now, we're all consumed with this thing called AI and how it's just rapidly changing everything from how we strategize and execute on the business side to what our consumer experiences are. It just feels like the world is changing. Where do you see AI transforming human learning over the next several years?
Well, usually I'm agnostic when it comes to tools. I gave a TED talk years and years ago, and I made the comment that if Enzo Ferrari would have fallen in love with a screwdriver the way that we fall in love with our new feature set, we never would have gotten the car. However, I think we're building a sandcastle in a swamp. And what I mean by that is that we have now had 2-3 generations of American adults, international too, but I'm kind of looking out from where I sit, who don't really understand what the internet is, can't explain packet switching, don't realize how the DNA of software influence the use of software or the business models or the culture. And so on one hand, the agnostic part of my tool using self says AI makes a few things that I do much more efficient. I mean, I think I would have finished my doctoral research in half the time or less. And when I call customer service, if it's not a well-known relationship and I'm getting routed to a call center to be talked at from a script anyway, I don't really care. But I'm also concerned about two things, really. One is that we are, elasticity of demand 101, right? The scarcer human interaction is, the more valuable it becomes. So some human functions are going to be becoming more and more dear. But in terms of policy, in terms of intentional regulation, we are way behind, and we have been for a long time with the technology. I highly recommend Tristan Harris and his work to your listeners, because I don't think we have an ethical handle around the development of AI. I think a lot of people falsely attribute intelligence where there isn't yet. Mm-hmm. And I say yet because it's developing. But if I regard AI as a trusted confidant, as many people do, without acknowledging that it's a large language model who's getting most of its material from data sets like Target or other retailers. And worse, it's giving me positive feedback no matter what I tell it. I don't know if you heard about this study that was run asking AI how to do a really good school shooting. And to my knowledge, Anthropic Cloud was the only one that pushed back. The rest of them were looking at schematics and ammunition and saying, have a happy shooting. So I think in a world where we already have a lot of confirmation bias and not a lot of tolerance for dissonant information that may challenge our worldview but help us get better. You may remember the Semmelweis problem with the physician in Vienna who said, maybe we should wash our hands. And the other physicians dunned him and ostracized him, and he wound up dying in an asylum. And it wasn't until, I think, Jonas Salk years later that people realized bacteria was a real thing. We don't like new information that challenges our comfort level. And AI is a slippery slope for that psychology.
Mm-hmm. And whether you're in an educational setting or you're in a business setting, leadership plays a huge role in really setting the tone for what kind of a learning environment is going to really flourish and be sustained over time. What do you think separates exceptional leadership from just good enough?
For me, it's a real yin yang of what people often call servant leadership and supporting individual endeavors from a place of care and empathy, and an inspiring, bold acknowledgement that leadership is different from management in the sense that while management is designed to keep the boat from leaking, leadership is designed to get it from one place to another. And by definition, that means leaving something behind. Leadership involves sacrifice. And the best leaders and the best organizations, I think I mentioned to you when we first met that one of my early mentors was Coach John Wooden, Hall of Fame coach at UCLA. And on the one hand, he still, when I worked with him, talked about building people as opposed to winning basketball games. So there's the servant leadership part. He was very heavily invested in everyone, if you've ever seen his pyramid of success, getting to that place where they had the peace of mind that comes from the contentment and knowing that they had done their very best to become the best that they could become. At the same time, there was a job to do. And so when Bill Walton refused to shave his beard, I don't know, this wouldn't fly in today's NCAA, but it was like, Bill, I respect your agency. You're your own man and we're going to miss you.
Yeah. That's a classic story that's been told so often. Yeah.
And so I think real leadership is building the kinds of bonds that can sustain divergence. And, for all the people out there who might still be hung up on DEI or whatever the controversy du jour is, and I say that I fully intend to be disparaging of everybody who makes everything controversial. It's a big fat waste of time and a big fat distraction designed for clickbait and who knows what else, but it doesn't fix anything. I honestly believe that diversity of thought, diversity of identity, diversity of perspective is the ultimate sustainable competitive advantage. You see it in nature. Mm-hmm. You see it in the Medici effect that created the Renaissance. And so if I'm dumb lucky enough to be in an argument with someone, which I don't see as a competition, I see that as a shared search for truth. But if I'm in a conversation with someone who has a different way of looking at things and I get to a solution that is better informed than where I started, I just got dumb lucky and won the prize. And I think that is another element of effective leadership that transforms, I'll rip off Jim Collins here, but that transforms good to great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that comes back even to an aspect of servant leadership when you as a leader have vulnerability and you're open to not always having to be the smartest person in the room. And you realize, hey, I can learn from my team as much as I'm going to teach them. And when you come in with that kind of mindset as a leader, that's when the best ideas flourish. That's when people are motivated and just unbelievable things happen, right? But it's intentional, as a leader to come in with that kind of openness to learn.
Absolutely. Well said.
Yeah. What's the best piece of business advice you have ever received?
There have been so many that it's almost like spinning a color wheel and watching it all blend into white. And I think that ultimately, as I picture that in my mind, that the best business advice I ever received. So I talked with Peter Drucker a few times toward the end of his life.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite quotes from him, and I won't get this word for word, but it's something like, the worst thing that management can do is the wrong thing more efficiently. I firmly believe that having the courage not only to listen, and we see this in there's a wonderful book called A Team of Rivals by Dorothy Kearns Goodwin about Lincoln's cabinet, and what you were just saying reminded me of how effective leaders can listen and not necessarily be right or even the best informed in the room, but also to filter things critically and not be afraid to change course when things aren't working. During the pandemic, I shifted gears. I started the pandemic like a lot of people, looking around during lockdown and thinking, okay, a bottle of red wine and a movie doesn't sound too bad tonight. And then about a year in, a friend of mine and I kind of goaded each other into doing something about our physical condition. And I wound up doing Ironman triathlons, and I've been doing them ever since. And the way to study for an exam, the way to build a strategic plan, and the way to prepare for an Ironman are not smoke one less cigarette or eat one less Twinkie or do an incremental change on the bad idea you were doing to begin with. Zeno's paradox: if you take a half step along the way and each step is a half of the last step, you'll actually never get from A to B. And it really requires, the best business advice I ever got in a sentence was change. And in that, it's not incremental, it's sea change. You pick your inspiring thing. It's burning the boats at the shore. It's changing careers. It's a short life, Dan. I don't know how many decades I have left, but ever since we started this conversation, I have been mindful that if your listeners are still with us, they're about half an hour in, which means they've just given us a half an hour of their lives that they're not getting back. And the sigma, the sum total of all the possibilities of that opportunity cost, are extreme. That's every other activity with every other person everywhere else on the world that collapsed into this.
Yes.
And I think being intentional about those changes that we make, whether it's for our health, whether it's how we listen to our coworkers or our family or our friends, that makes all the difference.
Yeah. I jotted this down as you were talking, David. Make every minute count. I think that's where we're getting at it. It's as we all have the opportunity in terms of the value that we get out of where we and how we choose our time. And it's the ultimate choice. It's not predetermined. And it comes back to making that decision and then applying yourself. And there's so much going on, obviously, in the world today. But when you think about the future, what makes you optimistic?
Conversations like this. As we were talking a minute ago, I got a little self-conscious. I'll confess this. Before I went into teaching and gave up my business practice full-time, between that moment and the time that I came back, the internet changed one thing for sure. There is so much more noise. There is so much information, and so little of it is credible. And so a lot of this sounds like Hallmark card material or bumper sticker stuff, I'm sure, because many of us have lost the threads of how to make it actionable, how to make it work for us, and how to understand the results that we're seeing so that we can benchmark that against what we intend. And what makes me optimistic about the future is getting up in the morning. This last week, I had two people in my life pass away. One was a relative, and one was a dear friend, former client, and occasional attorney. And they're definitely losses. You know, with death comes that quiet of finality that, you know, you don't get to have the next conversation. And so I think that what makes me optimistic is right there in the question. If I wake up tomorrow morning, I get to make that choice. And there's a nice book recently, you know, we've been talking about habits in our culture for decades and decades. And one of the most recent entries in the space is Atomic Habits. And I like what the author says because it's basically whatever you do today is a vote for who you want to be tomorrow. And so deciding what food I'm going to eat, or whether I'm going to work out, or how I'm going to maybe take a beat when that person at work is saying that thing that I realize I haven't been listening to because I've already been preparing my response. Everything that I've said to you in this conversation has levels to it, just like an organization goes from vision to mission to goals, objectives, all the way down to KRAs and KPIs. Everything that we talked about goes from conceptual all the way down to very tactical and behavioral. And at whatever level a person chooses to engage is the level that they get to see results. And that's what excites me about the future. I think that there's a lot of reason to worry about the future collectively, but that's above my pay grade. When I work with organizational decision makers and teams and communities on the ground, I still think that every human being has so much potential to do those things, to steward our environment, to help our communities, to be good humans to each other, even in a moment, which creates a ripple effect that we never see, but I know is there. So I gave you another long answer to a short question, but I am optimistic.
Yeah. And I think in our social media driven world today, I think there's an element that has kind of caught fire a bit, and that's the hypercritical noise, you know, and it's so easy to get blowback, you know, taking a position, maybe you have values and a perspective, and there are so many people that are waiting to attack that and to try to knock you down. And I was listening to another conversation recently, and it was all about the fact that you're going to get that pushback. You're going to get a lot of negativity. There's people that feed off of that. And don't be consumed by the negative comments of people you wouldn't want to change places with. So you're trying to put it into context and to try to stay focused on being true to yourself and bringing your perspective to make the world a better place. And I thought that, to me, is one of the biggest challenges of perseverance, right? In this world where there's so much negativity. Yeah. Well, do you have any other final advice for leaders that are trying to create more positive impact and elevate the learning and growth across their teams?
I do. I think that it's important. Simultaneously, I'm going to say, you know, I love cognitive dissonance, right? Because it's the immediate, like, wait, what? And that creates a powerful drive to understand. So I'm going to say something that may sound contradictory, but in my mind, it is both true. And one side of it is that learning is everything that we do. It's responsible for everything good in our lives. And we've been doing it from time immemorial. And we're going to do it. And so is everybody else around us, no matter what. If you don't give your people information, they are still going to come to conclusions. And they are more likely going to come to more positive or more negative in the extreme conclusions than whatever you thought was the truth to begin with. So given the fact that we are learning and sense-making machines, and we do this all day long, I think it's also important to acknowledge learning's presence in every single one of our business functions. So whether it is something that looks like it needs to be understood, like a new product rollout or a succession or strategic strategy, or whether it's just the day-to-day that maybe is even frustrating because you've explained it 13 times already and still there's a gap in understanding and you're not seeing the results that you expect. When we treat learning as a constant presence that also demands its own attention, well, Arthur C. Clarke said that with any sufficiently advanced technology, it looks like magic if you're not prepared for it. And that spark, that moment, light bulb moment is what learning is all about. So what I help organizations do is create that environment. It's like a garden with the sunlight and the nutritious soil and the irrigation and sometimes the kind words for the plants, to give people the best chance to create the outcomes that they expect from themselves and from each other. That whole myth of learning by doing, I'd like to put that to bed already. We learn by learning. If the cause and effect are immediate, if you put your hand on a hot stove and get burned, yeah, maybe you can learn by doing under those conditions. But in organizational life and in today's business and social culture, the effects of our actions and the chains over time and people from cause to effect are much too complicated for that. And we need to design with learning in mind.
Well, David, thanks again for sharing your very unique and compelling journey in life and really your perspectives around how we learn and how we can create these amazing learning experiences that endure and actually create tremendous impact. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Dan. I did as well. And if anyone wants to come find me, they can visit the davidpreston.net website. You can also find the book Academy of One at whatever your favorite online seller of books is. And, I mentioned that I became a better person and a worse business person when I went to Asia. I'm always happy to have these conversations. My hope is that whether it's as an individual leader or as a member of a team in organizational life, that we can find ways to translate, it's almost like reverse osmosis. We have taken in, as you mentioned, a lot of the clickbait and rage and, fight or flight stuff from the political messages and the, dark elements of the internet. I would very much love to see how people working together can tell a different story. So thanks very much for having this podcast and for inviting me on to join you.
Absolutely. And a reminder, please continue to give your gift of feedback to help make this podcast even better. You can do that by going out and giving a rating and a review. It's so easy to do on all the major podcast platforms, including Apple Podcast and Spotify. And as always, make sure to visit marketimpactnow.com for the latest in business leadership perspectives. So long until next time.